I was just pissed off, I was angry.
At what?
Well, you go through a divorce and...
For decades, fans have seen Phil Collins as the voice of a generation, a man whose music defined heartbreak, hope, and raw human emotion. But what most people don't know is that behind the glamorous career and legendary hits, Collins kept a secret locked away in his own home. A garage, ordinary on the outside, but inside, something unsettling awaited discovery. What could possibly lie hidden in the personal space of one of music's greatest icons? It began with something that seemed almost laughably small, a warped wooden panel at the back of Phil Collins's garage. The garage itself wasn't extravagant, not the gleaming, spotless showroom one might expect from a man of his stature. It was cluttered in the way all old spaces are. Dusty boxes, rusted tools, and stacks of things too sentimental to throw away, but too broken to ever use again. Yet this panel, crooked and slightly darker than the surrounding wood, stood out like a scar on the wall. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than the wear and tear of an aging English estate. But, as the workers carried out what should have been routine renovations, one of them absent-mindedly tapped it with the handle of a hammer. The sound was wrong. Not the dense, muffled thud of solid wood, but a hollow echo, as if the wall itself was keeping a secret. Curiosity, that ancient and dangerous impulse, pulled them closer. They pried at the edges with crowbars, splinters breaking loose until the panel gave way. What they expected was perhaps an old storage cavity, maybe a forgotten wine rack or a boarded-up vent. Instead, what revealed itself was far stranger, a door. It was narrow, almost child-sized, and so carefully concealed it seemed designed never to be found. The wood was swollen with age, its hinges rusted to a copper green, its iron handle nearly fused into the grain. Whoever had built it hadn't intended for it to be opened easily. Time itself seemed to have joined in that effort, burying it beneath decades of dust and decay. When the door finally groaned open, it exhaled a breath of air that had been trapped for God knows how long. It was thick, stale, and cloying, carrying the strange metallic bite of rust or blood. The workers recoiled instinctively, covering their noses, their laughter dying quickly as unease settled over the room. Beyond the threshold was a passage, barely wide enough for a single person to slip through. Its walls closed in uncomfortably, forcing anyone who entered to move sideways like a trespasser, squeezing into forbidden ground. The further they went, the colder it became, as though sunlight had never touched this hidden artery of the house. At the end lay a small, windowless chamber. Here, the secret began to unfold. Crates were stacked in uneven towers, some rotting at the corners, others sealed tight with rusted nails. A single bare bulb dangled from a frayed wire in the ceiling, swaying faintly though there was no breeze. Its weak glow seemed almost unwilling to reveal what lay within. The first crate was pried open with shaking hands. The workers expected, perhaps, memorabilia, gold records, old instruments, tour artifacts that a man like Collins might have tucked away. But the contents made their stomachs knot. Inside was no treasure trove of fame. Instead, the crate contained tattered clothing, stained and moth-eaten, a child's shoe, scuffed and impossibly small, scorched photographs, their images warped and half-erased, and broken instruments, guitars snapped in half, drumsticks splintered as though from rage rather than time. These weren't just objects. They were fragments of lives, each one heavy with a story that no one dared to tell. The room fell silent. Each man present felt a tightening in his chest, a creeping sense that they were standing somewhere they shouldn't. Something about these artifacts didn't feel forgotten. They felt hidden. Why would Phil Collins, a global superstar with access to every luxury imaginable, keep such disturbing relics sealed in the shadows of his own home? How long had they been there, waiting behind that forgotten door, their silence preserved by wood and dust? This was no ordinary collection. It was a puzzle, a message, perhaps even a confession. And as the men exchanged uneasy glances, one thought echoed in all their minds: Whatever secrets had lived in this garage, they were never meant to be uncovered. The moment the door swung wider, a heaviness seemed to press in on everyone inside. Dust swirled in the beam of the flashlight, clinging to the damp air like a shroud. The smell intensified, an acrid blend of mold, rust, and something far more unsettling. It wasn't the scent of time alone. It was the unmistakable odor of things left to rot. One of the workers stepped forward cautiously, covering his mouth with his sleeve. The crates were strange enough, but now that they were inside the chamber, it became clear this was no casual storage space. The walls themselves had been reinforced with steel sheets, corroded at the edges, but still sturdy. Someone had taken deliberate steps to make sure this hidden room was both secure and concealed. In the corner, a small workbench stood covered with a thick layer of grime. Scattered across it were fragments of objects impossible to ignore. Shards of broken glass, scraps of burnt fabric, and even what looked like handwritten notes smeared with water damage. The ink had bled into unreadable shapes, but a few words leapt out: fear, silence, and gone. The sight of them sent a chill down the spine of everyone present. As the flashlight swept across the floor, it caught something even more disturbing. A trail of dark stains, long since dried, stretched across the cracked concrete. They led directly to another crate, larger than the others, with its lid barely ajar. The men hesitated. Whatever was inside had been left exposed, and from the crack in the wood seeped the strongest odor yet. With shaking hands, one of them pulled the lid back. Inside lay a collection of items that felt painfully personal. Children's toys, a pair of worn shoes, and an old, faded drumstick, snapped in half as though broken in anger. Each object seemed tied to a story, a memory, or perhaps a nightmare. They didn't look collected for nostalgia, but preserved with a kind of grim reverence, as though each one carried the weight of something Collins couldn't let go. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Was this a shrine to lost moments of his life, or evidence of something far more sinister? Why hide these things, unless the very sight of them threatened to destroy the image the world had built of him? And if these were only the first layers of the hidden garage, what darker truths still lay buried beneath the dust and decay? What struck the workers most was not simply what they found, but the sheer scale of it. The deeper they dug into the hidden room, the more it became clear. This was not a random stash of forgotten belongings. It was a collection, meticulously gathered, obsessively curated, and disturbingly preserved. Each crate seemed to follow a pattern. One contained instruments, shattered guitars, warped vinyl records, and microphones bent as though ripped from their stands. Another held personal effects, scraps of clothing, jewelry, even household objects that looked decades old. None of them were displayed proudly like a collector showing off prized possessions. Instead, they were tucked away in silence, as though Collins had tried to bury their significance from the world. But what unsettled the workers most was how specific the items were. The toys, the faded photographs, the broken instruments, every piece seemed to belong to a story of loss, frustration, or violence. It didn't feel like memorabilia. It felt like evidence. And the fact that Collins had locked it behind a concealed door raised even darker questions. On the workbench lay a small notebook, its pages water-damaged but still legible in parts. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, almost frantic. Some entries described dreams, others listed names, many of which were unfamiliar. A few were crossed out violently, scratched over so forcefully that the paper tore. One chilling line read, "I keep them so they don't disappear." Another, "They won't understand." To the untrained eye, it might have looked like the ramblings of a man haunted by his past. But to those standing in the room, it felt like stepping into the mind of someone who couldn't let go of his demons. Every object seemed less like a keepsake and more like a fragment of something broken. Relationships, memories, perhaps even sanity. The room whispered of obsession, the kind that grows quietly until it swallows everything. It wasn't the grandeur of a rock star's hidden trove. It was something far more intimate and far more disturbing. The collection told a story not of fame, but of pain, and perhaps of secrets the world was never meant to see. And as the men realized the scale of what they had uncovered, one chilling thought lingered. If this was only one room, what else had been hidden within the walls of Phil Collins's home? When the next crate was forced open, the atmosphere shifted from unease to outright dread. Inside lay items that defied explanation, artifacts that seemed completely out of place, things that should never have been in a suburban garage at all. The first discovery was an antique mask, carved from dark wood and scarred with cracks. Its hollow eyes stared back at the men with an unsettling lifelessness, the kind of object more suited to a museum's anthropology wing than a rock legend's storage. Yet here it was, wrapped in torn linen, as though Collins himself had tried to keep it hidden. Beside it sat a bundle of military medals, tarnished and dulled with age. Some bore foreign emblems, unrecognizable even to the workers who prided themselves on local history. The ribbons were frayed, yet carefully folded, as if someone had once handled them with reverence. Why Collins would possess such objects was a mystery none could answer. Then came something far stranger. At the bottom of the crate, beneath layers of yellowing newspaper, lay a collection of letters sealed in wax. The envelopes bore no names, only symbols, circles intersected by jagged lines, repeating over and over like a code. One was opened, and inside was not writing, but a series of frantic sketches. Figures standing in darkness. A faceless man holding an instrument. And again, the words, "They don't understand." The more they uncovered, the heavier the silence grew. None of this felt like memorabilia from tours or gifts from fans. These were remnants of something personal, yet cloaked in secrecy. It was as if Collins had scavenged fragments from lives and histories far outside his own and locked them. The jar, unsettling as it was, turned out to be only the beginning. As the workers dug deeper into the chamber, they unearthed something that made the entire room feel like a tomb to music itself. Stacked carefully against the back wall were reels of magnetic tape, dozens of them, each unmarked except for crude scratches in place of labels. These were not studio recordings or forgotten demos, at least not in the way one would expect. When one of the reels was inspected, the tape was brittle, edges curled from age, but still intact. Alongside the reels was a battered tape recorder, its buttons worn smooth, its casing dented as though it had seen violent use. Curiosity pushed one worker to power it with a portable generator. The machine groaned to life, and the tape hissed as it rolled. What emerged from the speakers was not music. It was something else entirely. First came silence, then a faint crackle, followed by distorted sounds, half whispers, half moans, layered with abrupt bursts of percussion, like someone striking drums in desperation rather than rhythm. At times, there were faint traces of Collins's voice, but warped, broken, almost unrecognizable. It wasn't singing. It was closer to crying. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Was this some experimental project he'd abandoned? Or had they stumbled upon recordings never meant to be heard by the public? The sounds carried a suffocating weight, as though they had been born out of torment rather than creativity. It felt less like music and more like the documentation of a breakdown, preserved on tape for reasons no one could explain. The most haunting moment came when the tape abruptly cut into a series of thuds, followed by silence. And then, faintly, a voice whispered, "It doesn't stop." Whether it was Collins himself or someone else, none of the men could say. But it was enough to make them stop the reel and step back, shaken. Suddenly, the other items, the toys, the broken instruments, the strange artifacts, took on new meaning. Perhaps this was not just a collection of objects, but the architecture of an unraveling mind. This was not the legacy of a musician carefully preserving his history. It was the evidence of a man haunted by it. And in that moment, one question became impossible to ignore. What else had Collins recorded that the world was never meant to hear? Just when the men thought they had seen the worst of it, another discovery changed everything. At the far end of the chamber, half buried beneath discarded crates, stood a wall of old tools, rusted saws, blunt hammers, and shelves lined with jars of nails. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a dusty workshop corner. But something about the arrangement seemed off. The tools weren't randomly placed. They formed a neat, deliberate barrier. When one worker tapped against the wall behind the shelves, the same hollow echo returned, the sound of empty space concealed just beyond. With effort, they cleared the tools aside and pressed against the boards. To their shock, a second hidden door revealed itself, smaller and more sinister than the first. Its wood was darker, warped with age, and bound with a lock so rusted it appeared untouched for decades. It took nearly an hour of prying before the lock gave way. When the door finally opened, a rush of air surged out, colder, heavier, and far fouler than before. What lay beyond was not just another chamber. It was a room deliberately buried within the house, as though meant to be erased from memory. The flashlight beams swept across its interior, revealing walls covered in peeling black paint. Symbols scrawled in chalk and scratched into the surface ran in uneven lines, circles, crosses, arrows pointing inward. They gave the impression of rituals, of someone desperately trying to contain something that defied understanding. In the center of the room sat a chair, wooden and splintered, its arms fitted with crude leather straps. Dust had settled thick upon it, but the marks on the floor around it suggested it had once been moved, dragged, even fought against. The men froze, realizing they were no longer looking at mere storage, but at something that resembled a chamber of confinement. Scattered on the floor were scraps of paper, torn from notebooks. Words leapt out in jagged handwriting. "Stop the noise." "They watch." "Make it end." Each phrase was frantic, the desperate pleas of a man tormented by unseen forces. The workers stepped back, shaken by the realization. This was not the garage of a musician. This was something closer to a cell, a space designed not for creativity, but for control. And the question now loomed larger than ever. Who or what had Collins been trying to contain behind those walls? Among the scraps scattered across the floor, one discovery pulled the workers deeper into Collins's hidden world. A bundle of letters tied together with fraying string. Unlike the wax-sealed envelopes found earlier, these were personal, handwritten, and addressed in shaky penmanship. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible, and what they revealed was more disturbing than any artifact or broken instrument. The letters were not addressed to fans, nor to fellow musicians. They were written to himself. Page after page began with phrases like, "Phil, remember this," or "Don't forget what you did." Each letter felt like a dialogue between two versions of the same man, one pleading for forgiveness, the other refusing to grant it. In one note, Collins wrote, "The sound won't leave me. It follows me even in silence. I tried to burn it, but it survives." Another read, "They told me to keep the pieces. If I lose them, I lose myself." The language blurred the line between confession and command, as though he were documenting not just memories, but orders from something unseen. More chilling still were the names sprinkled throughout the letters. Some were familiar, friends, bandmates, even family. Others were complete strangers. Next to certain names were cryptic notations. "Gone," "Don't speak," or simply an X. Whether these were references to people he'd lost or something darker was impossible to say. But the implication was enough to turn the stomach. The workers exchanged uneasy glances as they read on. These were not the musings of an artist keeping track of ideas. They were the writings of a man unraveling under the weight of his own mind. The letters spoke of sleepless nights, voices in the walls, and shadows that moved when no one else was around. One final note stood out above all the others. Written in rushed, slanted handwriting, it read, "If they find this, they'll know. If they know, it ends. Burn the room before it burns me." The string holding the letters together was tied so tightly it had cut grooves into the paper, as if sealing them away was the only way to silence the truth. The men realized with a cold certainty. These weren't just private thoughts. They were warnings. And Collins hadn't written them for the world. He'd written them for whoever would come after. As the letters were pieced together, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Each note seemed tethered to a specific moment in Phil Collins's life. The toys found in the first chamber matched the years when his children were young. The broken instruments aligned with periods of reported creative struggles when his music grew darker and more experimental. Even the strange artifacts, those foreign medals and carved masks, corresponded eerily with his tours across distant countries. It was as though the garage was not just a hiding place, but a living map of his history, twisted and reframed through the lens of obsession. Every object carried weight, a reminder of something he couldn't leave behind. And in the letters, he admitted as much. One line read, "The past doesn't fade. It waits. It builds walls around me until I can't breathe." The workers began to wonder, was this Collins's way of grappling with fame, with the relentless scrutiny of the public eye? Or was it something far more personal, a confrontation with traumas that no amount of success could bury? His songs had always hinted at sorrow, loss, and inner torment. But here, in this hidden place, those themes weren't metaphorical. They were tangible. One letter referred directly to a night that fans still speculated about, an infamous concert where Collins appeared visibly shaken, struggling to keep rhythm. The note described it in unsettling detail. "They were in the crowd. I heard them calling my name between the beats. I played louder, but the noise grew with me." To the outside world, it had been chalked up to exhaustion. To Collins, it was something else entirely. Even more disturbing were the personal connections. Several notes mentioned his father, a figure rarely spoken of in public interviews. "His silence became my silence," one read. Another scrawled line, "I kept the pieces he left me. They don't belong to me, but they won't let go." The implication was murky, but undeniable. A haunting link to a past that seemed to claw at him long after he'd achieved global fame. The garage was no longer just a hidden chamber of strange objects. It had become a confessional, a place where the boundaries between memory, guilt, and imagination collapsed into one. And if these relics were all fragments of Collins's past, then the most disturbing truth was this: he had chosen to live among them. The more the men uncovered, the clearer it became. This garage was not built for storage, nor for secrecy alone. It was a prison, not for someone else, but for Collins himself. The evidence was scattered everywhere, but once pieced together, the truth was impossible to ignore. The chair in the hidden chamber told the first part of the story. Its straps were worn, not from disuse, but from repeated struggle. Marks on the wooden arms suggested someone had clawed against them, desperate to escape. Why would such an object exist in the home of a world-renowned musician? The letters provided a terrifying clue. One scrawled page read, "If I bind myself, the noise stops. If I move, it follows." It was as if Collins had tried to confine himself, locking his body in place to escape the torment in his mind. Even the arrangement of the walls spoke of imprisonment. The symbols weren't random. They were circles, traps, barriers. Perhaps Collins believed they could contain something, or perhaps they were desperate attempts to mark the limits of his confinement. To an outsider, they looked like crude graffiti. To him, they might have been the difference between sanity and collapse. The recordings only deepened the mystery. The distorted reels of sound, those desperate rhythms and broken cries, could now be heard in a new light. They weren't failed experiments. They were the soundtrack of a man trying to drown out voices only he could hear. The garage was not just his hiding place. It was his stage, his cell, and his confessional all at once. Neighbors had occasionally spoken of strange sounds coming from his property late at night, pounding rhythms, sudden bursts of noise, even screams muffled by walls. At the time, they assumed it was rehearsal. Now, in the context of this room, those sounds took on a darker meaning. They were not rehearsals. They were battles. The workers looked around the chamber and realized they weren't standing in a storage space at all. They were standing inside the architecture of a man's torment. This was not where Collins kept his demons. This was where he locked himself away with them. And the most disturbing question yet remained unanswered. If this was his prison, who or what was the jailer? By the time the final crate was opened, the men were no longer curious explorers. They were intruders standing in the ruins of a man's private war. The last container was smaller than the others, yet sealed with layers of duct tape, as if its contents demanded absolute secrecy. With trembling hands, they peeled it open. Inside lay a simple wooden box, polished but scarred by age. Etched into its lid were the same symbols that covered the hidden chamber's walls. When the lid was lifted, the truth revealed itself, not with grandeur, but with quiet devastation. The box contained fragments of Collins's life, snippets so personal they felt almost sacred. A lock of hair tied with thread. A torn photograph of a young boy with half the image burned away. A crumpled concert ticket with the words "First Time" written on the back. Each piece carried the weight of memory, not as trophies, but as scars carved into physical form. But beneath those fragments lay something darker, a final letter. Unlike the others, this one was sealed in an envelope marked with a single phrase, "Do not open." Yet curiosity overcame caution. Inside was a confession, written in uneven script, almost illegible in its desperation. I could not escape. The music was never mine. It spoke through me, demanded I keep the pieces, demanded I build the room. The noise does not stop. It feeds. And when they find this, they will know I was never alone. The men fell silent. It was not the confession of a criminal, nor the diary of a collector. It was the cry of a man who believed his own fame, his own genius, had been born from something darker than talent. The garage was not his hiding place. It was his altar, his sanctuary, and his prison. When the workers finally sealed the door and left, they carried with them a story too heavy to share openly. For what could they tell the world? That one of music's greatest icons had hidden away a room filled with fragments of madness, guilt, and memory? That behind the rhythm and the lyrics lay a life consumed by shadows? The disturbing truth was simple, yet terrifying. The man adored by millions may have been fighting a battle no one ever truly understood. Phil Collins's garage was never just a place for tools or storage. It was a window into a life burdened by shadows, memory, and obsession. What do you think truly haunted him? Fame, guilt, or something far darker? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold discoveries. After all, the stories behind legends often reveal more than the music ever could. And sometimes, they're more haunting than we dare to imagine.